The story of the civil rights movement of the 1960s begins long before the first marches and protests captured national attention. Rooted in centuries of racial oppression and segregation, African Americans faced systemic injustices that permeated every aspect of their lives, from education and employment to housing and voting rights. The Jim Crow laws of the South enforced a strict racial hierarchy, dictating where black people could live, work, learn, and even sit on a bus. Yet, despite the relentless barriers, a spirit of resilience and determination thrived within black communities, laying the groundwork for a transformative movement that would reshape the nation. Life under segregation was harsh and dehumanizing. Black children attended schools that were poorly funded, while hospitals and public services were vastly unequal. In many towns, separate drinking fountains, restrooms, and public facilities were the everyday reminders of a society determined to maintain racial inequality. African Americans often faced intimidation and violence when they dared to challenge the status quo, yet they persisted, finding ways to support one another and cultivate communities of strength, culture, and pride. Churches, social clubs, and local organizations became safe havens where ideas of justice, equality, and collective action were nurtured. The 1960s emerged as a pivotal decade because these long-standing frustrations collided with a growing national consciousness about justice and human rights. Television and newspapers began to broadcast the struggles of Black Americans into homes across the country, allowing the broader public to witness the courage of individuals standing up against segregation. Images of peaceful protesters being attacked with fire hoses, beaten during marches, or arrested for simply asserting their dignity galvanized people from all walks of life to pay attention and, in some cases, take action themselves. Central to the movement was the principle of nonviolent resistance, championed by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., and supported by countless ordinary citizens. The philosophy was simple yet profound. Lasting change could be achieved not through hatred or revenge, but through courage, moral clarity, and unity. Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, boycotts of buses and businesses that enforced discriminatory policies, and organized marches were all strategies designed to highlight injustice while maintaining moral authority. These actions captured the hearts and minds of Americans and gradually forced political leaders to confront the undeniable need for reform. The journey was neither easy nor quick. Every victory was hard-won, often at great personal risk. Families were threatened, leaders were jailed, and many paid the ultimate price for daring to demand equality. Yet, through it all, a sense of hope and determination endured, a testament to the unwavering belief that justice was possible, and that a nation could be better if it lived up to its founding ideals. As we explore this pivotal chapter of history, we invite you to join us on this journey through the courage, sacrifice, and triumph of those who fought for civil rights. If you find this story inspiring and want to learn more about the heroes and moments that shaped the movement, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. By supporting the channel, you help us continue sharing powerful stories of history, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Together, we can honor the legacy of those who paved the way and ensure their lessons are never forgotten. As the 1960s dawned, the simmering frustrations of decades of oppression found a voice through leaders who understood the power of moral courage and strategic action. And at the forefront stood Martin Luther King Jr., a man whose vision of justice would come to define an era. King, deeply inspired by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and the principles of nonviolent resistance, believed that change could not be achieved through anger or violence, but through persistent, disciplined, and peaceful action that exposed the injustice of a system built on discrimination. His approach was revolutionary in its simplicity and its audacity. demanding that those who had been silenced and marginalized confront oppression not with fists, but with unwavering dignity and a collective spirit that could neither be ignored nor defeated. The streets of Montgomery, Alabama, became the crucible for this philosophy when the Montgomery bus boycott erupted in 1955 following Rosa Parks' courageous refusal to surrender her seat to a white passenger. Though the boycott predated the broader 1960s movement, it became a template for the strategies that King and others would employ in cities across the nation. For over a year, African Americans in Montgomery organized carpools, walked miles to work, and endured intimidation and threats, demonstrating that coordinated, nonviolent resistance could disrupt entrenched systems of power. King's eloquence and steadfast leadership transformed a local protest into a national symbol of courage, showing that ordinary people, united by a shared purpose, could challenge deeply ingrained injustice without resorting to hatred or retaliation. From these early victories, the movement expanded, with marches, sit-ins, and boycotts emerging as the primary tools to shine a spotlight on inequality. In Greensboro, North Carolina, young college students initiated sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, refusing to leave until they were served, and in doing so, ignited a wave of similar protests across the South. Each sit-in became more than a demand for service at a diner. It became a moral statement, an assertion of humanity against a backdrop of laws and customs designed to demean and divide. King recognized that these acts, though seemingly small, accumulated into a crescendo of pressure that forced the public and the political establishment to confront the realities of systemic racism. Boycotts, too, evolved into a potent weapon, combining economic leverage with moral clarity. The Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated that when communities refused to participate in unjust systems, they could not only sustain themselves through solidarity and mutual support, but also make those in power painfully aware of their dependence on compliance. King and other leaders encouraged communities to persist, to endure hardship without violence, and to maintain the ethical high ground, understanding that the struggle was as much about winning hearts and minds as it was about dismantling discriminatory policies. Marches became another emblem of the movement. Large gatherings that blended determination with dignity, transforming public spaces into arenas of moral witness. The March on Washington in 1963 epitomized this approach, drawing hundreds of thousands of people who chanted, sang, and listened to speeches that called for equality, justice, and an end to segregation. King's "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, crystallized the aspirations of millions, weaving together the pain of the past with a hopeful vision for the future. The power of such gatherings lay not only in their numbers, but in the discipline and peacefulness that accompanied them, offering an undeniable contrast to the violence and prejudice they sought to dismantle. Beyond the symbolism, these methods carried practical significance. Sit-ins disrupted daily routines in establishments that refused to serve black patrons. Boycotts affected the economic interests of businesses complicit in segregation. And marches drew media attention that broadcast the struggle to a national audience. King and his contemporaries understood that media exposure was essential. Images of peaceful demonstrators being beaten, arrested, or subjected to abuse by authorities revealed the stark brutality of segregation in a way that words alone could not convey. Nonviolent action became a language through which the nation could witness injustice firsthand, compelling individuals and institutions to reckon with the moral imperative of equality. At the heart of this strategy was the belief that every individual had a role to play, that courage was not reserved for leaders alone. Communities organized, young people volunteered, and ordinary citizens joined in ways that collectively amplified the message of justice. King's ability to articulate a vision of nonviolence inspired others to act even when fear was palpable, demonstrating that moral conviction, combined with organized effort, could generate a force far greater than the sum of its parts. The movement thrived not because of singular acts of bravery, but because of a shared commitment to a principle that transcended personal safety, comfort, and convenience, transforming the struggle for civil rights into a profound moral campaign that engaged the conscience of the entire nation. The methods pioneered and popularized during this period were not only effective in achieving tangible victories, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but they also reshaped the broader discourse about justice, citizenship, and human dignity by demonstrating the power of peaceful, organized, and principled resistance. King and his allies created a blueprint for social change that continues to inspire movements worldwide. Their insistence on nonviolence was not a limitation but a source of strength, proving that courage, patience, and moral clarity could confront entrenched power structures and achieve transformative results. In recounting this story, one sees how the combination of strategic action, unwavering commitment, and the steadfast belief in human dignity created a movement whose lessons resonate far beyond the turbulent streets of the 1960s. The struggle for civil rights in the 1960s reached a new intensity as the movement moved from localized acts of defiance to highly visible campaigns that captured the nation's attention and forced the American public to confront the deep-seated injustices of segregation and discrimination. The Montgomery bus boycott, which had begun as a local protest sparked by Rosa Parks' courageous act of defiance, evolved into a symbol of collective determination and strategic ingenuity, demonstrating how ordinary citizens could wield their power when united by a common purpose. African Americans in Montgomery organized carpools, walked miles to work, and refused to comply with a transportation system that treated them as second-class citizens, sustaining their resistance over more than a year despite intimidation, arrests, and threats of violence. The boycott revealed not only the economic leverage of the black community, but also the moral clarity of a population committed to nonviolent change, and it propelled Martin Luther King Jr. into national prominence, cementing his role as the spiritual and strategic leader of a growing movement. Building on the lessons of Montgomery, activists expanded their efforts with the Freedom Rides of 1961, daring to challenge segregation in interstate bus travel across the South. Integrated groups of young men and women boarded buses with the express purpose of confronting discriminatory practices in bus terminals, waiting rooms, and public facilities that remained segregated despite federal laws. The riders faced extreme hostility, buses were firebombed, passengers were beaten, and law enforcement often looked the other way or actively participated in the harassment. Yet, these acts of courage captured headlines across the nation and exposed the gap between legal mandates and everyday realities, showing that systemic change required both grassroots activism and federal enforcement. The Freedom Rides embodied the principle that nonviolent protest was not passive but a dynamic, deliberate confrontation with injustice, one that drew attention, inspired solidarity, and challenged the conscience of those who remained indifferent to the suffering of their fellow citizens. Perhaps the most iconic of the era's mass demonstrations was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963, a moment that crystallized the movement's goals and aspirations into a singular, historic event. Hundreds of thousands of people converged on the nation's capital, filling the streets and the National Mall with a vibrant display of unity, purpose, and hope. The march combined the voices of ordinary citizens, clergy, activists, students, and political leaders, all demanding the end of segregation, the protection of voting rights, and economic justice for African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, resonated far beyond the assembled crowd, capturing the imagination of a nation and embedding the movement's ideals into the cultural consciousness of the United States. The march demonstrated that peaceful, organized mass action could both inspire hope and exert pressure on lawmakers to act, revealing the power of collective, morally grounded demonstration to reshape public opinion and political priorities. These events were not isolated acts of protest, but part of a carefully orchestrated strategy that emphasized visibility, moral authority, and disciplined action. Each campaign, from boycotts to rides to marches, functioned as both a practical tactic and a symbolic statement, communicating to the wider public that African Americans were determined to claim the rights promised to them by the Constitution and by the principles of justice and equality. The courage of those who participated, often in the face of life-threatening danger, underscored the high stakes of the struggle and the depth of commitment required to confront entrenched systems of oppression. News coverage, photographs, and first-hand accounts brought these experiences into homes across America, allowing millions of citizens to witness the brutality of segregation, the dignity of peaceful protest, and the steadfast resolve of a community unwilling to accept anything less than equality. The Montgomery bus boycott, freedom rides, and March on Washington also illustrated the interplay between local action and national impact, showing that sustained efforts at the community level could ripple outward to influence federal policy and public perception. These campaigns created pressure on political leaders to act, ultimately contributing to landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which codified protections against segregation and discrimination. The events of this period highlighted the necessity of both grassroots mobilization and strategic leadership, demonstrating that societal transformation requires coordinated effort, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to principles of nonviolence and justice. Moreover, these actions emphasized the importance of storytelling and symbolism in activism, as images of peaceful demonstrators being met with hostility conveyed a powerful moral argument that words alone could not achieve. The courage of ordinary citizen students, mothers, clergy, and laborers became a lens through which the nation could confront the contradiction between its ideals of freedom and equality and the lived realities of millions of its citizens. Each protest, ride, and march carried with it a narrative of dignity, sacrifice, and determination, reinforcing the notion that the fight for civil rights was not merely a political struggle, but a moral imperative that demanded attention, empathy, and action. In weaving together these campaigns, one sees a tapestry of courage and strategy, a movement that combined local initiative with national visibility, moral clarity with tactical intelligence, and individual bravery with collective solidarity. The Montgomery bus boycott, freedom rides, and March on Washington collectively demonstrated the extraordinary power of organized, nonviolent action to confront injustice, transform public consciousness, and lay the foundation for a more equitable society, creating a legacy that continues to inform and inspire the pursuit of justice and human dignity today. As the civil rights movement gained momentum throughout the 1960s, the energy and determination of young people became an indispensable force in the struggle for justice, and organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee (SENCE) and the Congress of Racial Equality (CORE) played a critical role in channeling this youthful vigor into purposeful, impactful action. Unlike earlier phases of the movement, which had been dominated by established leaders and long-standing institutions, these groups embraced the fresh perspective, courage, and creativity of students and young adults, recognizing that the future of civil rights depended on the willingness of the next generation to confront injustice directly and persistently. From college campuses to small towns across the South, young activists organized, strategized, and acted with a combination of moral conviction and tactical insight, transforming local struggles into national campaigns that demanded attention and respect. SINCs, founded in 1960, emerged from a wave of student-led sit-ins and became a hub for grassroots activism, emphasizing direct action, voter education, and community empowerment. The organization recognized that the fight for civil rights could not be confined to symbolic gestures alone. It required tangible, measurable engagement that would empower African Americans to claim their rights as citizens. Young members traveled across the South, often at great personal risk, conducting voter registration drives in rural counties where systemic barriers, intimidation, and violence had long suppressed black political participation. These campaigns were painstakingly meticulous, involving door-to-door outreach, education about voting rights, and the organization of local communities to stand up against the entrenched powers that sought to maintain racial hierarchies. In many cases, the courage and dedication of these young activists challenged adults within their own communities to overcome fear and participate in the democratic process, illustrating the transformative power of leadership that emerged from the very people most affected by oppression. CORE, with its roots in earlier nonviolent campaigns, complemented the work of SENC by organizing freedom rides and direct action initiatives that exposed the contradictions between America's democratic ideals and its discriminatory practices. Young activists from CORE boarded buses, traveled through hostile territories, and confronted systemic segregation in public facilities with unwavering resolve. Each encounter with hostility, from verbal abuse to physical violence, was met with discipline and steadfast adherence to nonviolent principles, sending a clear message that moral authority and courage could challenge even the most entrenched structures of injustice. The participation of young people in these actions brought a sense of urgency and vitality to the movement, demonstrating that courage was not limited by age, and that organized, principled action could effect meaningful change. These student-led initiatives were not merely reactive. They were strategic, designed to highlight the inequities faced by African Americans and to pressure local, state, and federal authorities to respond. In towns where black citizens had been systematically denied the right to vote, voter registration drives became acts of defiance and empowerment, symbolizing the broader struggle for recognition, equality, and dignity. Activists often faced arrest, intimidation, and violence. Yet the determination inspired wider participation and drew national attention to the realities of systemic racism. Media coverage of their efforts broadcast the courage of these young individuals into living rooms across the country, humanizing the struggle and making it impossible for the nation to ignore the urgent demand for justice. Moreover, SENC and CORE cultivated a sense of solidarity and mutual support among activists, recognizing that the emotional and physical toll of confronting entrenched racism required community and resilience. Training in nonviolent resistance, discussion of ethical strategy, and shared reflection on experiences in the field helped sustain morale and reinforce the ethical foundation of the movement. Young activists were encouraged not only to confront injustice in public spaces, but also to nurture leadership within their own communities, fostering a culture of participation and agency that would extend beyond any single campaign or event. The emphasis on collective action, rather than individual heroism, ensured that the movement remained grounded in principles of justice, empathy, and communal responsibility. The impact of these youth-led organizations was profound, shaping both the trajectory of the civil rights movement and the broader understanding of social change in America. By combining courage, intelligence, and moral clarity, SENC and CORE demonstrated that transformative change could emerge from the energy of the young, that direct action and persistent engagement could challenge even the most deeply rooted systems of discrimination. and that empowerment through education, organization, and participation was a fundamental strategy for achieving equality. Their efforts were instrumental in creating the conditions for legislative victories, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and in establishing a model of activism that would influence subsequent movements for justice and equity. Through their tireless work, young activists affiliated with SENC and CORE showed that the struggle for civil rights was not a distant or abstract fight, but a lived, immediate, and morally imperative endeavor, one in which courage, strategy, and solidarity could overcome fear, apathy, and oppression. Their stories of perseverance, sacrifice, and leadership remind us that social change is cultivated not only through the vision of leaders, but also through the collective commitment of those willing to act with integrity, resilience, and hope. By mobilizing young people to participate in voter registration drives, direct action campaigns, and grassroots organizing, these organizations infuse the civil rights movement with vitality and moral authority, ensuring that the call for justice resonated across generations and left an indelible mark on the history of the United States. The relentless courage and strategic brilliance of activists during the 1960s civil rights movement ultimately transformed the social, political, and legal landscape of the United States, culminating in landmark legislation that enshrined principles of equality into federal law and altered the trajectory of American society. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were not spontaneous achievements. They were the product of years of organizing, protest, and sacrifice, a testament to the power of sustained, disciplined, and morally grounded activism that began with small acts of defiance and expanded into a nationwide movement demanding justice and recognition. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the most comprehensive pieces of civil rights legislation in American history, struck at the heart of legalized segregation, outlawing discriminatory practices in schools, workplaces, and public accommodations, and marking a decisive step toward dismantling the systemic barriers that had constrained African Americans for generations. This law was the culmination of countless marches, sit-ins, and economic boycotts, each designed not merely to protest injustice, but to expose the moral and practical contradictions inherent in a society that claimed to value freedom while denying it to a significant portion of its citizens. The path to passage was fraught with political maneuvering, opposition, and societal tension, yet the persistence of activists, community organizers, and sympathetic lawmakers created an environment in which justice could no longer be postponed. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., alongside organizations such as SENC, CORE, and the NAPE, understood that moral authority alone was insufficient. It needed to be coupled with strategic pressure, visible demonstrations, and the mobilization of ordinary citizens willing to endure harassment, arrest, and even violence to assert their rights. The momentum generated by highly publicized events, including the March on Washington and the Freedom Rides, applied both moral and political pressure, compelling legislators to confront the urgency of a nation on the brink of moral reckoning. The Civil Rights Act, in this context, was not merely a legal instrument, but a symbolic acknowledgement that the country could no longer maintain the artificial and oppressive boundaries of segregation without challenging its own foundational ideals. Following closely on the heels of these efforts, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 addressed the systemic denial of political power that had long marginalized African Americans, particularly in the South, where discriminatory practices such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation had effectively suppressed black voter participation for decades. The Act prohibited these practices and provided mechanisms for federal oversight, ensuring that African Americans could exercise their constitutional right to vote without facing the extraordinary barriers that had previously rendered their voices nearly invisible. The campaign for voting rights had been long and perilous, with activists facing not only legal obstacles but also brutal acts of violence, as seen during the infamous events of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, where peaceful marchers were met with beatings and tear gas as they sought to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The national attention these events garnered, broadcast through television and newspapers into households across the country, created a wave of public empathy and outrage that lawmakers could not ignore, ultimately facilitating the passage of legislation that codified protections for black voters and reshaped the democratic landscape of the nation. These legislative achievements were inseparable from the grassroots activism that fueled them, highlighting the intricate interplay between local courage and national impact. The efforts of young people mobilized by Senkik and Kaur, the disciplined leadership of figures like King, and the collective resolve of ordinary citizens created a force that could challenge entrenched power structures, transform public opinion, and produce tangible legal change by demonstrating the efficacy of organized, nonviolent action. The movement proved that systemic transformation was achievable when moral clarity, strategic planning, and communal solidarity converged in pursuit of justice. The passage of these laws also represented a shift in societal consciousness, signaling that the moral and legal recognition of African Americans' rights was not negotiable, but essential to the integrity of American democracy. Moreover, the impact of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act extended beyond their immediate legal provisions, serving as catalysts for broader social change and inspiring subsequent generations to continue the struggle for equality in areas ranging from education and employment to criminal justice and political representation. The laws provided not only protection but also affirmation, reinforcing the principle that African Americans were full citizens entitled to the rights and opportunities guaranteed by the Constitution. This legislative foundation created space for continued activism, empowering communities to challenge systemic inequities and fostering a culture of civic engagement that would resonate through decades to come. The narrative of these legal victories is inseparable from the lived experiences of the countless individuals who risked their lives, reputations, and livelihoods in pursuit of justice, and it underscores the profound connection between collective action and structural reform. Each protest, march, voter registration drive, and act of civil disobedience contributed to the momentum that made legislative breakthroughs possible, demonstrating that meaningful change requires both moral courage and sustained, coordinated effort. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 stand as enduring monuments to this principle, embodying the culmination of a movement defined by its strategic vision, ethical commitment, and unwavering belief in the possibility of a more just and equitable society. In reflecting on these achievements, one recognizes that the legislation was far more than a bureaucratic milestone. It was a moral triumph, a validation of decades of struggle, and a tangible testament to the power of ordinary people to confront injustice and reshape the legal and cultural fabric of their nation. The civil rights movement, through these acts of courage and resilience, demonstrated that legal equality, while never the end of the struggle, could be realized when vision, organization, and determination converged in pursuit of a shared ideal, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire and guide the ongoing quest for justice and human dignity in America and beyond. As the 1960s drew to a close, the civil rights movement had achieved what many once thought impossible: the dismantling of legal segregation and the passage of transformative legislation that reshaped the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 enshrined the principles of equality and justice into federal law, marking a monumental step toward a more inclusive and fair society. These victories, however, were neither sudden nor effortless. They were the culmination of years of unwavering dedication, courage, and sacrifice by countless individuals who refused to accept the status quo. From the well-known leaders whose names echo through history to the ordinary citizens who quietly risked their safety to stand up for their rights. Each march, sit-in, boycott, and voter registration drive contributed to a growing tide of change, showing the world that organized, principled action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Yet, as monumental as these achievements were, they did not erase the deeper social and economic inequalities that had persisted for generations. Racial discrimination did not vanish with the stroke of a pen, and the fight for justice remained ongoing. Many communities continued to face systemic challenges in education, employment, housing, and access to health care, revealing that legal reform, while necessary, was only one part of the broader struggle for equality. The movement, in exposing the structural inequities that had been normalized for so long, illuminated the work that still lay ahead, inspiring a new wave of activists and thinkers to tackle these persistent issues with the same courage, creativity, and moral conviction that had defined the earlier era. One of the most enduring legacies of the civil rights movement is the blueprint it provided for future generations of activists. The strategies honed in the 1960s: nonviolent resistance, organized mass action, grassroots mobilization, and the strategic use of media to expose injustice have become foundational tools for movements seeking social, racial, and economic justice across the globe. From the fight against apartheid in South Africa to campaigns for voting rights and racial equity in modern America, the lessons of the movement resonate with a clarity that transcends time and geography. Young people, inspired by the bravery and vision of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and countless unsung heroes, continue to engage in the struggle for equality, building upon the foundation laid by those who came before them. The movement also fostered a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of social justice struggles. It demonstrated that the fight for civil rights was not limited to African Americans alone, but was part of a broader pursuit of human dignity, fairness, and opportunity for all marginalized communities. By challenging the moral conscience of the nation and demanding that America live up to its own ideals, the activists of the 1960s helped to create a society more aware of the importance of equality, justice, and inclusion. Their work reminds us that progress is never automatic. It is achieved through sustained effort, strategic thinking, and the courage to confront injustice, even when it is difficult or dangerous. As we reflect on this transformative period, it is important to recognize that the movement's story is not just a chapter in history, but an ongoing call to action. The struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices of the past serve as both inspiration and guide, encouraging individuals today to engage in efforts that promote equality, challenge discrimination, and build communities grounded in justice and mutual respect, whether through education, advocacy, community organizing, or everyday acts of courage and kindness. The principles of the civil rights movement remain relevant and vital, offering a roadmap for creating meaningful change in our own time. The story of the civil rights movement is, above all, a story of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of collective action. It teaches us that societal transformation is possible when people unite around shared values, that moral courage can overcome fear and opposition, and that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, progress can be achieved through dedication, strategy, and unwavering commitment to justice. As we honor the achievements of those who fought for civil rights, we are reminded that their legacy continues to shape our world, inspiring new generations to challenge inequality, advocate for the marginalized, and work tirelessly toward a society where the promise of freedom and equality is not merely aspirational, but real for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most pivotal chapters in American history. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, we invite you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that celebrates courage, justice, and the fight for equality. By supporting the channel, you help us continue sharing powerful narratives that illuminate history, honor the past, and inspire action today. Together, we can keep the lessons of the civil rights movement alive, ensuring that the struggle for justice continues and that the voices of those who fought for equality are never forgotten.